Dusk slid over the prairie like a slow-moving tide, turning the horizon the color of old copper as Hoda Blackthorn rode toward the lonely cabin crouched against the pines. The air tasted of dust and memory, two things he'd never been able to outrun. He paused a good 20 paces back, letting his horse breathe, letting his own heart quiet after a long day of being followed by whispers in town. Through the warped window he saw the widow Kaya Red Willow washing a single tin plate, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her shoulders curled in that small way grief teaches a person to fold themselves. He wondered if she heard her own heartbeat echoing in that tiny room, wondered what loneliness did to a soul this young, wondered why he felt drawn to her more than caution allowed, and the wondering tugged him forward like an unseen hand, until the world held its breath at his first knock on her door, waiting to see what would break open next. The door creaked as she pulled it a few inches wide, eyes dark and guarded as storm water under ice. She recognized him. Everyone knew the quiet cowboy who kept to the edges of things, and her gaze sharpened with a politeness too thin to hide her hesitation. Hoda dipped his head, offering respect he'd rarely received himself. Behind her, the cabin smelled of boiled water and pine smoke, a scent that soothed and scolded at the same time. He started to speak, but the faint impression of horse tracks outside caught his attention. Parallel grooves, fresh from a heavy-set lawman who liked to sniff around places he didn't belong. Sheriff Amos Bright River had come earlier, that much was certain, and Kaya's silence confirmed it even before she whispered, "You shouldn't be here." Shame stirred under Hoda's ribs as he realized he was yet another burden on her shoulders. And yet he couldn't step away, not when something in her eyes begged for a gentler fate she'd long stopped expecting. She opened the door just enough for him to slip inside, her body turned sideways as though bracing for a blow from the world beyond her walls. The moment the latch clicked behind them, a quiet tension wrapped the room, settling between them like dust on an abandoned saddle. Hoda noticed details that spoke louder than words. The single cracked cup on the shelf, the patched floorboards, the threadbare blanket folded with precision. Kaya returned to her washing, moving with a tired grace, and he set a small bundle, coffee beans, dried meat, on the table without saying her name. Her hand stilled midair when she saw the gift. Gratitude flickered through her expression, quickly smothered by pride sharpened by months of judgment. Misery had taught her to keep her heart tight as a fist, but Hoda could see the faint tremble in that fist now, fear, exhaustion, or the quiet ache of being seen at all. Outside, a lone wind slapped the shutters as if warning them both of eyes still watching, leaving the moment trembling between refuge and danger. Hoda knelt beside the loose board near her hearth and tapped a nail through the wood with the soft rhythm of someone who'd built and buried more than he cared to remember. Kaya didn't ask why he helped. Instead, she poured him a tin cup of warm water and set it within arm's reach, the gesture small but trembling with meaning. Her breath hitched when their fingers brushed, though neither of them commented. Some truths don't need names to be felt. The evening light slipped across her cheekbones, softening her grief and sharpening her resilience all at once. Hoda dared a glance at her as she returned to her work, wondering when a woman who carried so much pain learned to move so quietly, wondering if she'd ever been looked at without being judged, wondering if the kindness she'd just offered him was the first she'd given in months, and the questions haunted him like distant thunder, promising a storm he didn't know whether to fear or welcome. The room dimmed as the sun sank, and in that dimness, words began to loosen like knots finally giving way. Hoda spoke first, voice low and rough, a stone worn by years of guilt. He told her about his brother, the one he'd failed in a moment of hesitation that cost more than a lifetime could repay. Kaya didn't pity him, she simply listened, which stung sweeter than forgiveness. After a long silence, she shared her own story, each sentence a shard carried too long beneath her ribs. Her husband's illness, the debts he left behind, the neighbors who avoided her not out of meanness but out of the discomfort of facing a sorrow they couldn't fix. She described waking each morning with the weight of survival pressing into her spine, how she sometimes stared at her hands and wondered how much more they could bear. Her voice cracked and she turned away, but Hoda rose and stood beside her, not touching, simply offering steady presence in a world that had given her nothing steady in return. Something unspoken passed between them, fragile as breath, and it left the air trembling with possibilities neither dared name. A sudden lantern glow spilled through the slatted window, slicing the darkness with the harshness of accusation. Sheriff Amos Brightriver's voice followed, thick with self-righteous authority as he declared that a widow hosting a cowboy after sunset invited talk, and talk could ruin a woman faster than drought ruined crops. Kaya's shoulders curled with humiliation at his implication, her fingers trembling around the edge of the table. Hoda's jaw clenched so tight he tasted copper, But he kept his fury quiet, knowing loud anger would only feed the sheriff's smug power. Amos threatened consequences if Hoda was still present come morning. Town housing for Kaya, fines for impropriety, all under the guise of protection. When the sheriff finally rode off, the dust of his horse lingered like an insult hanging in the air. Kaya shut the door slowly as though afraid the world might burst through it at any second, her breath shaky as if one more blow might turn her to ash, and the uncertain silence that followed scraped against Hoda's heart like a dull knife. Hoda stepped toward her, voice gentler than she'd ever heard from him. "Please pack your things." The words startled her into stillness, her eyes flashing with confusion, hurt, and a flash of fear. He quickly explained, not as rejection but as warning. The sheriff intended to remove her from her land under the pretense of town laws, and leaving tonight was the only way to keep control of her future. Kaya stared at the familiar corners of her cabin. The drying dishes, the bed where her husband once slept, the wall she'd survived winter behind. Her breath shuddered with the weight of letting go of a life that had already taken so much from her. Hoda thought for a moment she'd refuse, anchored by grief or fear, but then a tear slid down her cheek, soft as surrender. "Where would we go?" she whispered, voice brittle as wind-worn bone, and the tremor in her question told him she was no longer afraid of him, only of losing what little safety she'd fought to keep. They packed in the dark, hands brushing by accident, bodies moving in the intimate choreography of urgency. Kaya folded her husband's arrowhead necklace into her satchel with trembling care, the gesture an act of farewell she'd long avoided. Hoda wrapped her blanket tight, tying the cords with a tenderness that made her throat tighten. Outside, hooves thundered, too close too soon. The sheriff was returning, maybe with deputies, maybe with intentions far darker than warnings. Hoda helped Kaya mount his horse before he swung up behind her, the heat of their closeness pressing something fiercely alive into the hollow spaces inside him. She gripped the reins, knuckles pale, but there was fire rising beneath her fear now, something braver, something choosing forward. Amos shouted from the ridge, gunmetal glinting in the moonlight, but Hoda veered toward a narrow cliff trail only he knew, one that forced riders to trust stone more than sense. The horse leapt into the shadows, wind screaming past them, Kaya clutching the saddle horn as though holding on to a future still too fragile to believe in, and the night swallowed them before judgment could catch up. Dawn painted the sky in pale gold by the time they reached an old line shack near the river, half forgotten by ranchers and held together by stubborn timber and luck. Kaya stepped inside first, blinking at the slanted beams of sunlight warming the dusty floor. It wasn't much, but it was safe, it was quiet, and it was theirs for the moment. Hoda leaned in the doorway, promising he'd help her rebuild, board by board, sunrise by sunrise, without asking anything in return. She looked at him then, really looked, seeing not a drifter or an outlaw but a man who stayed when leaving would have been easier. Her breath loosened, her shoulders eased, and a faint, fragile hope flickered inside her like the first spark coaxed from cold tinder. She turned back toward the empty room as if already imagining what her life could become here, and the soft hum in her chest left Hoda wondering what tomorrow might bring if neither of them ran. Some stories begin with thunder, but others with a quiet knock on a lonely door, the kind that echoes through a life long after the sound fades. If you take anything from this moment, let it be this. When two wounded souls cross paths, sometimes the smallest courage is believing you're worthy of shelter in someone else's gaze. And maybe, just maybe, hope waits for all of us in places we haven't yet dared to look, hovering in the pause before the next choice calls our name.